Hello and welcome back to the Sex and Healing podcast. My name is Erin Kyna. I'm your host, and thank you so much for joining me as we take this wild ride together through the realms of sex and healing. Today's episode definitely comes with a trigger warning. We'll be discussing topics such as non-consensual sex and childhood abuse. So if you're sensitive to those topics, I invite you to be incredibly mindful as to whether this is a podcast that you should listen to, or if you're choosing to listen to it, to make sure that you are listening to it at an appropriate time, and also to be mindful of who else may be able to hear you listening to this podcast. So to carry on from last week's solo session, I'm going to share a little bit more today about what I've been navigating in my personal life. You would have heard me talk about in that last episode titled Me and Mum, that I hadn't yet found a place of conclusion with some of the things that I was going through. And I feel like some of that has come to conclusion. So I feel much better and much clearer about sharing it. I can see that my brain functioning and my capacity has returned to normal, which I'm very grateful for. So I'm able to communicate better. I'm feeling much better, and I feel ready to share this part of the story. So if you haven't listened to that episode called Me and Mum, I would recommend that you listen to it, because in there I do talk a little bit about what it's like to share personal stories and what I need. So I just want to gently recap that as I share this story, I'm asking for no unsolicited advice, no pity and no sympathy, but I invite you to listen as an observer to see what universal messages and wisdom can be found in my story that may be of benefit to you, and that we can all grow together, and that my suffering doesn't become your suffering. And in fact, just as I have, that you can take these stories and use them as an opportunity for growth and potential. So when I think about my past, I went through some unfortunate childhood experiences. I experienced physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. And I have tried really hard in my adult life not to be my past, and almost to a fault. I somehow in my head had categorized people. There's one group of people who went through fucked up things, and there's another group of people that I would call normal people with normal lives, with no serious traumas like that in their childhood. And I used to try and be a normal person. I wanted to overcome my past and my experiences to the degree that I could fit in what I called the normal people, and that no one would know what I'd been through, and that I wouldn't be tarred or damaged by those experiences. There's something called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Test, the ACEs test, and I score a 7 out of 10 in that, which is very high. And although I also had really positive childhood experiences, and I had times where I felt safe and times when I felt loved, I did also have these very deep, very painful experiences, coupled with the fact that I'm an extremely sensitive person. So there might be other people who also lived through similar experiences that I did, that weren't as emotionally damaged by it, maybe were not as psychologically damaged by it, perhaps had a bit more resiliency. But I think trauma is trauma, and we can't compare, and we shouldn't compare. So I'm just aware of what I have been through. I am aware of my own sensitivities and this compulsion inside of me to try and be the normal person, to try not to let any of those experiences be part of my present reality, and to not let my trauma dictate who I am or dictate what kind of potential I have to experience in this life, or not hinder me in any way from having the experiences that I want. I did not want to be a wounded or traumatized person. But my lover said to me once, "But baby, you are. And it is what it is. You've been through things that you can't change. And if you had your hand cut off, well, you can't change that. Your hand has been cut off. It just is what it is." And that was very helpful to me, to just accept it without judgment. I had been judging myself as being one of the people that was not normal, as somehow making that mean that I needed to change, or that I was not good enough as I was, and that I was going to be more lovable or more successful if I could fit in the normal people category. So to be able to accept the things that I've gone through and be able to accept the traumas that I have carried and that might still be present in my life in certain ways just gives me a greater sense of peace. So when I went through the experience in the last couple of weeks with mum and recognizing that trauma got triggered, what I've done since then in research has shown me that often when similar trauma is triggered in the present moment, that we revert back to the first experience. So with mum, the first experience of the fear of losing her to suicide was roughly 17 or 18 years ago now. So I would have been 20. And the first experiences that I had of physical or sexual abuse were in my early childhood. So when any of those triggers might come up, then it also reverts me back to that age. And very interestingly, I was listening to the episode with Dr. Gertrude, because I fucking love to listen to my own podcasts because I get to be the observer. And I'm like, wow, that's really great conversation. And I loved that conversation with Dr. Gertrude. And we talked, so that was the one about pleasure and being healthy. And in that, I spoke to the fact that both Gertrude and I are aware that our trauma response, our fight or flight, our nervous system response to trauma is to freeze, and that we freeze and that we don't speak up. When I think back to these first childhood experiences that I had, I also had a response of freezing. So ironically, Gertrude and I recorded that episode about a month ago, and it went live on Tuesday. And I thought, wow, there I am talking about this trauma response. And that is exactly what I experienced in this past week and a bit. So I had what I'm going to call a non-consensual sexual experience. So within the kink community, we have some fantastic guidelines that I would love to see translate into the mainstream sexual model as well, that is very protective of the people that are doing it. And one of the most common rule that we have is safe, sane, and consensual. So that's an acronym we use, SSC. So basically that means, what is safe? Are we practicing in ways that are safe? So on a very broad level, we could say, are we having safe sex? Are we protecting ourselves from disease and from pregnancy and from undue injury? Is it sane? So that means that are the two people or more people that are participating in this engagement of sane state of mind? So that means not to be high, not to be drunk, not to be emotionally unstable. And is it consensual, which means have we both consented to what's going to take place? So both or more, because it's often more than two. But these rules, when followed, make for a very sex positive environment, a very safe environment. And so consent is something that we talk about in kink a lot. And we talk about explicit consent as well, and being very clear about our wants and our desires and our boundaries. And in fact, when kink is executed well, that is an absolute necessity, that you must be able to communicate your boundaries. You must be able to communicate your limits clearly and explicitly. You must be able to express your desires and what you want to create, like the experience or the scene that you want to create. But we also have another acronym, which is RAC, which means risk aware consensual kink. So this came from the concept that some kink is inherently not safe and some kink is perceived as inherently not sane. And yet it can still happen between two or more consenting adults. So risk aware consensual kink really speaks, maybe is not so transferable to the vanilla world because they might not be necessarily enjoying riskier activities like kink, some kink, but it's recognizing the fact that some people might not think that this is safe and some people might not think that it's sane, but we're coming here fully aware of those risks and we're choosing to consent to that. So in a well-run community, these rules are upheld. So I would expect everyone in our community to abide by these rules and to be empowered by these rules and want to express them and educate others who, you know, if you've got a vanilla partner or you're having a sexual engagement with someone who isn't aware of this, that you would use it as an opportunity to empower and educate. So what happened the other week was someone from the kink community who I knew was interested in me, that was very obvious and had been for a while, because when I first met him, it was at an event that was designed for intimacy and eroticism, and we're dressed in lingerie, and consent was also not a part of the way that this event was hosted. And I actually spoke to the host afterwards and said I was really uncomfortable in that, and we're in a public environment and I didn't feel like I could say no, and you didn't use consent, and I got put in that position and I was uncomfortable. So that was the first experience that I had with this person, was one that made me feel uncomfortable and non-consensual, but it certainly didn't feel like it was problematic. It just was like a little red flag, not very comfortable. Let me take this opportunity to educate the host. Like, these things should be executed much better than this, especially as a leader or a host. So, you know, in the kink community, I'm really considered inexperienced, and yet I just have this inherent knowing of what can be done better and what kind of situations and environments I want to be in and that make me feel safe in order for my sexuality to be expressed. So this person we'd been meaning to catch up for dinner since pre-corona time, so for most of this year, and then corona happens and no one's seeing each other, and, you know, things are very quiet, and then something stirred the connection, and he reached out again and asked me to go to dinner last week, and I had said I'm not in a good emotional place, and he said, would you like to be held? And I thought, yeah, actually I really would. Now that was my first opportunity to really express what I truly wanted and what my boundaries and limits were, and I didn't. Part of that was because I assumed this person's from the kink community, and I assumed that nothing that is non-consensual would take place. And, you know, if that person had not had kink experience, there's a far higher chance that I would have said, yes, I really would like to be held, but I'm not available for anything sexual. So, you know, this is not a story of blame, and it's not a story of accusation by any means. This is an opportunity of learning and growth for both of us. But he ended up coming over, and what happened throughout the course of the night is I share what I was going through. I cried a lot. He eventually invited me for a cuddle. We start cuddling. He starts touching, running his fingers along my body, and I really enjoyed that. Like, I really did crave touch, but inside I was very clear that I didn't want sexual touch. And again, yet another opportunity in which I could have used my words and I didn't. So I have a lot of compassion and understanding for myself, because this is me responding to trauma. This is me in freeze response. I don't have the access to the language that I normally would. I'm not thinking as rationally as I normally would. I'm relying on the people around me to also take care of me and protect me in my emotionally vulnerable state, especially if you know that you're coming over because I am in a very emotionally vulnerable state and you know why. So this night ended up with him having sex with me without a condom. And at some point, like, I was able to stop it. I was crying, and eventually I was able to ask him to leave, and he did so. And I felt really disappointed in myself. Like, what are we doing here again? Like, this is not the behavior that I would expect. This is not a circumstance that I would expect for myself at this age, with this knowledge, with this experience. This is something, ironically, that would have experienced at 20. And now I see, like, yes, Erin, that your brain has reverted basically back to that capacity, and it's okay. So I wasn't able to talk about that because that really upset me. And I was crying about it for about a week. I felt really a lot of judgment, a lot of just, I don't even need to explain those feelings to you. I know that you know how I was feeling. Unfortunately, most of us have had those experiences. Ugh. And so I needed to take care of myself, and I needed to self-soothe, and I needed to get support and care from my healer. And chiropractic helps me a lot in being able to process that stuff out of my nervous system. So I then went away for the weekend. I really unplugged from all of this stuff that's been going on in my life, I relaxed, I unwound. And when I returned, I was in a much, much better place to have a conversation with him. So I sent him a message and told him how I felt, that I didn't feel good, told him that I didn't feel that that was abiding by the rules of our community, that I was relying on him to do so because I was an emotionally compromised place, and that I want us both to learn from this because I can recognize what I could have done differently, and I'd like him to do the same. And his reply was the best I could have asked for. It was, if you were to think, what would you want to hear, Erin? It would be to take responsibility, to apologize, and to self-reflect and commit to doing something different. And that's exactly what he did. So I feel like that has now got a bow wrapped up on it. That is now part of the past. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to experience it again. I don't like, done. I'm never going to put myself in that position again. I'm going to be so much more mindful right from the beginning to always clearly express what I want and what I need. You know, I had a really good conversation with my lover about it afterwards. He was an amazing, as always, incredible support for me and helped me process a lot of the feelings and emotions that came up around it. And he has offered to place me under restriction, which sounds restrictive, and it's not in any sense. He said that he does not want to hinder my love or my spirit in the world in any way. And yet he recognizes that because of my very high levels of empathy, that I can be a magnet for these kind of situations. And so we now have a rule that I am not to have any physical contact except for a goodbye hug with any man on the first engagement. So whether that's the first time I meet them or whether we go on a date. So no contact on the first engagement until he and I have spoken. So that gives me an opportunity to reflect in a safe space with someone I trust about the experience, what I want to express. And I feel incredibly grateful for that rule. And I feel this sense of protection that's with me all the time, that someone that loves and cares for me is giving me additional reasons to really be mindful of my boundaries and uphold my boundaries beyond any sense of empathy that I have for anyone else or any discomfort that I feel or any of those reasons why we allow this to happen. So I also feel like I'm just completely uninterested in dating any other men. Like I get such incredible access to the most pure, powerful, masculine energy through my lover. I feel like all my needs for that are very well met. My sexual needs are very well met. Very few people could fuck me that way. So very few men, I'm going to say, could fuck me that way. So if they're not going to meet sexual needs for me, mentally and emotionally, I don't really connect with men all that deeply. It doesn't satisfy me anywhere near as much as women. So I feel like, great, well, we can kind of take men off the menu altogether because I'm very satisfied and I love the connection that I have and I love the access and the presence of that masculine energy in my life. And from now on, really, I'm only interested in pursuing connections with women. So that all feels very good. It feels like a quantum leap from where I was last week, where I couldn't talk about it without crying. But it also made me really reflect on the kink community here in Bali, because I do believe that a really well-run community that upholds very good standards and has very good standards demonstrated at every event and every gathering and every course and every class, that situations like this should not happen. That the likelihood of these kind of situations would be greatly reduced and that these kind of behaviors would be reflected on by the community. And I know in certain communities that this kind of situation would be brought to community leaders to discuss and to consider what would happen, and that like a breach of consent and, you know, well, a breach of safety, sanity and consent, all three of those rules were broken in this circumstance, that's something that you wouldn't be alone in experiencing, that you would have people that you can talk to about the experience and that could guide you and could help you navigate the experience between the two of you. And yeah, it just, to me, was disappointing that we don't have a community that upholds standards in that way. We don't have a community that is led by people who are exemplary in their demonstration and upholding of the rules. So despite being relatively inexperienced in this community, I definitely have that knowing in my heart of the kind of sexual experiences that I want, the kind of community that I want, the kind of leadership that I want, or that I would display. And that's something that, I just need to consider going forward and think about, how can I make a positive contribution? How can I take my relative inexperience but deep inner knowing of the power and potential that exists in this world and in this lifestyle, and how can I share that with the world in my way? Because I have so many women in my life who would be interested in so many of the sexual experiences that I'm having, but feel a lot of resistance to community or to the way things are run. And so who knows? Watch this space. But really, I want this episode to be the beginning of a conversation about consent, because consent should be enthusiastic, ongoing consent. Well, this is going to be an enthusiastic and ongoing conversation and education about consent. It was not a thing for me growing up. It was not something that was ever educated. It was not something that was taught in sex ed. It was not something that was demonstrated. Consent in my day was basically coercion. Like, even if you resisted or acted like you didn't really want it, that wasn't a sign that you didn't really want it. That's not where someone is going to stop. And I talked to a really good friend about this, and she actually put me onto a podcast about consent. So I've been really deep in the consent conversation this week. And she said to me, prior to meeting her husband, there were probably only 3 men that she'd slept with in her entire life who hadn't coerced her to have sex the first time. And that really breaks my heart. It's almost like that is the standard. That's the norm. That doesn't matter if you say no, doesn't matter how sweetly or how, gosh, it's hard to explain, because as a woman, and I can only speak for myself, obviously, and the type of woman I am, perhaps, there is a desire to keep everyone happy, to not hurt people's feelings, to not create conflict, to not upset anyone. And so often when we express a consent, or we express that we don't really want something, we say it in a really nice and sweet and gentle way, because we don't want to fire up and we don't want to start something. But that in itself is not considered a problem in the mainstream community often. That's often something that there's still this little push beyond that. And, I could dare say that we could speak to the majority of men in our age bracket and ask them, have you pushed? Have you pushed for sex when you know that there was resistance? And I would say the majority of them would say yes. I would say, if you ask the majority of women in our age bracket, and by our age bracket, what do I mean? We've got listeners decades younger and decades older than me, but let's speak to us collectively. Has every woman had an experience where she has felt pushed, where she didn't really want it, but you end up doing it anyway? So it's so common for all of us. The results of that can vary from something that feels very mild to something that feels very traumatic. And, that's each for us to determine and each of us to navigate. And what someone will want to do, the kind of retribution they might seek as a result of that, is also individual. For me, I just felt it was really important to communicate and to educate from a place of no blame and no accusation. I just wanted that person to know that that behavior breaches our community standards, that behavior in general is not okay, and to really be aware of the consequences of that and to think about that in the future before they do it. That friend of mine that had only had 3 partners that hadn't been coercive had said to me, also that there was one circumstance that was so passionate and so hot, and she was so obviously a yes to that entire experience. And just before he had sex with her, he said, "Are you sure this is what you want?" And she was like, "Fuck yes." She said it was so hot. And it is, consent can be something that adds to the sexual experience and doesn't have to take it away. It doesn't have to be this dry, mental, exhaustive, analytical experience. It can absolutely be a fun and passionate and sexy one that adds to the desire. But I know that the more respected I feel and the more I feel that my boundaries will be upheld, the more deeply I can open, the more deeply I can let go, the more of my sexuality, my energy that I bring, the more wild I can become, because I feel the safety of that respect. And without that, if I'm having to be on guard and make sure and protect myself in any way, or like have to guard that, then that prohibits how much of my sexuality I get to experience. It prohibits how much of my sexuality that I get to bring. And I would like to think that we're sleeping with people whose sexuality we want them to bring, that we want to be having sexual experiences with people who are passionately engaged, who are enthusiastically contributing, and not just laying there frozen and silent. But it's all part of an ongoing conversation. So I appreciate that you guys create this space for me to be able to share, to be part of my process. It actually really helps me greatly to verbally process these experiences. And I really hope that through my experience that you guys can be more empowered, and that we can prevent more of these situations that are uncomfortable, that are unpleasant, that are violating or abusive, by empowering ourselves with consent, by understanding it, by respecting it, by educating about it. And I am the consent queen. A friend of mine said today, "Please never ever send me a photo of that," which was like an erotic thing that we were talking about. I was like, "Don't worry, girl, you'll never get a photo from me that you didn't ask for." I'm never going to send that, but it must be consensual. Like, it's so empowering. It feels so good. It allows our sexuality to expand greatly. So I am super curious to hear from you. I would love to know what you gain from these episodes. I would love to know what breakthroughs you have, what experiences you have. You know, a big part of what I teach in the world about sexual empowerment for women is about this very thing, which is why it was hard for me to have this experience, because as a teacher, it's important for me to embody that. So for me to be having these experiences, and yet the women in my course were so incredible. When I did choose to share this with them as to what I was going through, the way that they loved me and supported me and saw me and respected me was so healing for me. And I love those women with all of my heart, and I love the work that I do. I gain so much from watching these women heal and expand in their own sexuality. And, you know, I've found it for myself. I'm becoming the woman that I was always meant to be, by really allowing this part of myself full space and full power and full honor in my life, like all the other versions of me. And I want that for all of us. I want every person on this planet, and certainly every person in my audience, to feel that kind of empowerment that comes from a healthy and a fully expressed sex life. Sex life sounds so fucking insignificant compared to what it really is. It's like our sexual power, our inherent sexual power, our pleasure, the ability to absolutely transcend through the physical vessel and through pleasure is just fucking out of this world. So I'm grateful for this space. I'm grateful for what I have been taught. I'm grateful for what I'm able to teach. And I'm grateful for you tuning in and listening. So thank you so, so much. Please share this with anyone that you think would benefit from it, for anyone that needs to hear this story, anyone that would like to learn a little bit more about consent. And please always let me know what you want to hear. So between now and next episode, I'm sending you all of my love. Mwah.